And again, my name's Mike Ramsey, and I'll just give you a brief background. I started out doing what you guys are doing. Back in the mid 1976, as one of the first employees of the new Georgetown Loop Railroad in Colorado, and that's where I learned Railroad 101. Was there. How to be a brakeman, how to give signals, how to make sure I don't get run over by a train, those types of things. I eventually went on to the Cumberson Toll Tech as a fireman and a trainman, then Durango and Silverton as a fireman and a mechanic and machinist in the roundhouse, hostler, that type of stuff. Then on to help get the Grand Canyon Railway started in Williams, Arizona in 1989. I was an engineer, fireman, mechanic, conductor, brakeman, dispatcher, safety guy, clean the bathrooms, whatever it took. That's what I did there. And then I went over to the dark side as a railroad safety inspector to the Arizona Corporation Commission and eventually the Federal Railroad Administration, where I retired after 25 years, 2 years ago. So in the FRA, I was a field inspector, mostly in operating practices, but because of my steam background, I also was a motive power and equipment inspector. I did both because of my steam background. And the last 10 years, I was a passenger rail safety specialist for passenger rail, including tourist and museum railroads just like this, all over the country. So again, like some of you say, I know just enough to get myself in trouble. And not really an expert on any one thing, but at least a little bit of background. So based on everything you guys have just told me, I mean, we've got everything from brand new people here who this is their first time. They may or not know anything about basic Railroad 101 or railroad safety, all the way up to current locomotive engineers for the BNSF and long-time railroad employees and everything in between. People that are training to be brakemen, trainmen, engineers, firemen, and people training to be car hosts. You know, two different spectrums of what we do here. The Abilene and Smoky Valley is like a lot of nonprofit railroad operations all over the country. And these rule books that we passed out to you are designed just for this type of an operation. Now, this particular book of rules and the safety rules that we have here are based on ones that were developed for the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, Colorado. They're a small volunteer operation that runs trains occasionally, primarily with all volunteers. So it doesn't have to be real complicated. It doesn't have to be real complicated. A lot of the information in these books is extremely important. Some of it is just good reference. So if you're trying to understand how to do something, particularly on the safety rule side, it's there. Now you've noticed we've got two rule books there. And you know, there's some changes in here from the way things were done. And the previous rule books were wonderful rule books. They served you guys well for a long, long time. And they were excellent because they were still based on basic railroad safety. What we've done here is just kind of expanded on them a little bit and reorganized them in a different way so they're easier to find things. It's a change. Hopefully, because we're getting more volunteers, more people involved, and as Ross hopes, maybe more trains to operate someday, and we become a busier operation, some of this will make more sense. But today is primarily a one train operation. We could still just stick with the basics in here. So don't worry, we're not going to go over every rule and read every rule. We're not going to do that. We're going to talk about the high level part and the important stuff. That's the plan. Okay, you've got two books there. You've got your operating, air brake, maintenance of way rules in one book. And then you got your safety rules in the other book. Why would we have separated those? Anybody got an idea why we would have two separate rule books instead of just putting them all in one binder to make life easier?
Because the non-crew cargo hosts and et cetera need the safety rules too?
Exactly. Because people that are non-operating people, they also have to understand safety rules as well. Usually, you know, the people that are going to be engineers and firemen and train crew and dispatchers and all that kind of stuff, they're focused on operating rules and specific things on how to get the train over the railroad safely. And they also have to worry about safety rules. How do I not get run over by a train? But then we've got everybody else on the railroad, car hosts, depot agents, anybody, mechanics that aren't part of operating. They need to understand basic railroad safety 101 as well. They might not need to understand all the things on getting an engine over the road or engine locomotive inspections or things like that, but they do need to understand safety 101. So that's why we have that safety rule book here. Now, with that being said, since we've got a combination of operating people, train crew, engine crew, and people that want to be train hosts that aren't in that group, that group's going to get a little bit of how to operate the trains as well. But everybody's going to get the basic safety, and that's what we're here for today. So we got the safety rules. That's your second rule book. You'll find that there's some rules that are in the operating rule book are duplicated in the safety rule book. And there's reasons for that too, and we'll talk about that later. The new timetable, special instructions we call it, and we'll talk about how that fits in with your operating and safety rules. It's basically an extension of that. And general orders. Did you pass out general orders? Okay, well, we have general orders as well. That is the next extension, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. And then the basic rules, review, discussion, and exercises. We're going to talk about key definitions. We're going to talk about die-hard cardinal safety rules for everybody. And I think those all got passed out on that sheet. We'll discuss that. We're going to talk about blue signal protection, which is important to everybody. And that's how we keep, if we have to work on a locomotive or a car, how we're going to protect ourselves to make sure nobody couples to that locomotive or car or moves that locomotive or car while we're under it working on it. Air brake test and inspection, just basic air brake training 101 and how to do a test. Securement, to make sure that when we leave a train, it's not going to go anywhere, that it's secured and safe. Some basic maintenance away for our sole maintenance away guy. But if anybody's out there, we always encourage volunteers to help out at maintenance away. It's a proud job, I'll tell you. And then the hours of service. For those people that are going to be operating trains, this is for them. Folks that are not going to be operating trains, not going to be brakemen, conductors, engineers, firemen, this doesn't apply, but you're going to get a little training on it because you get to sit through this class. So you'll at least have that basic understanding. So any questions thus far? I haven't put everybody to sleep yet. I don't hear any snoring, but we'll try and keep it that way. Okay, on that operating air brake maintenance away book, that first book. The difference between that and the safety rules is that first one just talks about train operations, air brake rules, and maintenance away rules. It's got 3 concise sections in it just for those 3 things. And it applies only to those involved in train operations, in other words, engineer, fireman, trainman, switching, and the maintenance away guys. And this is effective May 1st, as per the general order that Ross hasn't passed out yet. In fact, all this stuff, the timetable, the rule books, are all in effect May 1st. And I'm emphasizing that because when we do the short open book quiz at the end of this, that's a question on it. So there's a freebie right there. It's real easy. Okay, let's give a brief background. All these rules and general orders and timetable special instructions and all this stuff, this is all swirling around in your head. The idea of this is a way to manage communications. So you as volunteers have the understanding of, okay, what is the instruction manual for this way at railroad? How do we operate trains? and how do we do it safely, and how do they communicate this to us? That's what this is. This is the how-to process for running a railroad with these documents. Quick background history on operating rules and timetable. As a lot of you historians and railroaders know, back in the day, long before I was around, they operated trains, and to get out on the track, to operate on the main track, your authority was a schedule, a timetable schedule. So they gave all the employees this timetable, and you couldn't go by this station before this time. You absolutely could not go by that station before this time, because there might be another train coming the other way that had to stop at that station. And this kept trains from running into each other. If a train had to stop out there for some unknown reason, or for a reason like taking on water, they had the rear brakeman or the rear flagman truck on back down the track a certain amount of distance, and he would provide protection to keep any following train from running into him. Then there were the trains that weren't on a schedule that they had to send out, and those were on were called extra trains, and the dispatcher had to work with the operators at the various depots along the line to put out what they called train orders, giving that train crew very specific instructions that, based on schedule, you can get out and run from here to there to get out of the way for the next train, and then run from here to here to get out of the way. It was a pretty complicated but effective system. Believe it or not, we still do it that way at the Durango and Silverton. Not too sure why, but we still do. And it works pretty good, but it takes a lot to understand it. Fortunately, that's something you don't have to worry about here, but the railroads, as they move forward, they didn't really have any rules. Everything they had was in this timetable special instructions. It was basically, don't get run over by a train and try not to run it anymore. That was pretty much it. But as time went on, back pre-Civil War and post-Civil War, they started to understand that, hey, we're operating on each other's railroads. We need to have a little bit more prescriptive rules on how to do this so we don't wreck our trains and run into each other. And they started putting that in the timetable, and that became known as special instructions. And then later on, they got more rules, and they go, you know, this is going to be a pretty big timetable. Maybe we better make a rule book. So that's how the rule book came about. So it all was in there with the timetable. So the earliest known rule book was published by the Western Railroad in Massachusetts in 1842. It was 18 pages long, and it had 13 rules. That must have been nice, 13 rules. I'm sure they were very effective rules too. So that's the first known operating rule book. Then the railroads started to try and figure out a way to standardize things. Not all of them did, but that was kind of the goal. There are several books or rules used today that all came from the Uniform Train Rules and rules for the movement of trains by telegraph. And then that developed into the Consolidated Rule Book, and then eventually into the Standard Code, which a lot of railroads, including the Santa Fe, I believe, and the Rock Island, used for a while. A lot of the railroads kept their own rule books. They didn't want to go to a standard rule book. And that it just depended on the period of history and the railroad, what was going on at any given time. But the point was, they all had some type of a rule book. Pretty soon they did start standardizing the rules. As time went by, particularly the Western railroads in 1982, they all got together, the big railroads, the Santa Fe's and the Union Pacifics and the Southern Pacifics and all that, and they worked as a group to form what's now called the General Code of Operating Rules. Some railroads have adopted, most of the Western railroads have, and others. But most museum railroads or railroads like this one, you don't need anything that comprehensive and complicated. And I'll explain a little bit about that later. But the rule book that we have today is loosely based on that General Code of Operating Rules, on current best practices, whether it's general things, safety things like blue signal protection, or getting on and off equipment, or just general inspections and air brake tests. It's all based on current best practice in the industry, but it's modified to work for a small volunteer operation like this. So the way this whole thing works with your operating roles, I'm big on visual things, so you've got your, let's just talk about the operating role book. You've got this book here. This is your base. This, for operating trains and doing brake tests and moving trains safely, this is your base. This is the book that tells us this is the how-to. But every once in a while, we need to modify that or amend it a little bit to reflect current operations. That's where this comes in. So what we have out today is this document, which tells you that this is now in effect. And it also tells you that, oh, by the way, we made a safety rule book too, and it's in effect as well. So this is how that information was delivered through this. And it has some other specific information in there just for about train operations that are unique to the Abilene and Smoky Valley. So you got the timetable and special instructions. I keep saying timetable. Again, there's no time in here anymore, but that's just a legacy identifier for this document. The railroads still use that term today. There's no time in it necessarily, but it's still called timetable special instructions because it always has been. So try not and get confused where it says timetable. It's just the legacy name of the document. So timetable and special instructions, they revise part of a rule if needed and include additional information. General orders, that's what Ross didn't pass out, but the general order is kind of the thing you look at daily, and it will tell you if anything has changed in any of this stuff. You won't see them very often. I think the one that Ross is going to pass out later basically says, oh, by the way, effective May 1st, all this stuff's going to be in effect. And that's how they delivered that information to you, so you know. And then track bulletins, you don't use them here, at least not yet. That is a very specific document that someday when you're running more trains or you've got some extensive track work going on, Ross might want to have a specific document to give to the engineer and the train crew each day saying, oh, by the way, we got a speed restriction out there between milepost such and such and milepost such and such. Please no faster than 1 mile per hour or something like that. Or the switches out of service at Enterprise or something like that. That's what those would be for. As far as I know, you don't use those, but they're available for use if you ever get busy enough or it warrants that. And they would probably come out from Ross. So again, the operating rule books out in the big railroad world, they probably change every 5 to 10 years. In fact, general code, you guys from the BNSF, have you got the new general code yet? Mm-hmm. Okay, edition 9 was supposed to come out April 1st. I didn't know if it had yet or not. Okay, that's all right. I'm just wondering. I haven't been to a G-Corps committee in a while, but they were hoping that it was going to come out on April 1st, the new edition. So anyway, on this railroad, hopefully these are going to last you for a long, 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 long time. I don't think you're ever going to have to make many changes after this. The timetable, you know, we had one, what was it? The last one was 2 years ago, timetable number 11. Of course, the new one comes out because we're introducing new rule books, different information now. Things are changing. So the timetable is telling you that. The general orders, depending on what's going on, maybe every 4 to 6 months. On this railroad, probably not that frequently. We might get going on this and get you guys all trained up on rules, and then one of you guys will say, Well, I don't know what Ramsey was thinking about. This rule doesn't make any sense for the Abilene and Smoky Valley at all. We can't be doing this. And then he'll go talk to Ross, and Ross will go, yeah, I don't know what Ramsey was thinking about either. We need to change that rule. And then the general order will change the rule. And that'll get published. And then you guys will know it, because when you come to work, you'll look at those every day to see what's current. You guys that are car hosts and things like that, you might look at those because that might make a difference on a safety rule. But because you're such a small, tight-knit group, if anything changes, you're probably going to know about it pretty quick anyway. But this is the delivery method and the intent of this process here. Does that make sense? Kinda? A little bit? I know to you railroad guys it does. I just want to make sure that if you have any questions on how to deliver information, this is how a railroad does it. This is how they do it. Okay, now the safety rules, that other book. This one. That applies to everybody. As one of the volunteers pointed out before, people that are not in the operating department still need to be safe as well. Whether you're a car host, a depot agent, a greeter, working in the roundhouse, working out on the track from a safety perspective, they need information as well. So that's what the safety rule book, it's for everybody, everybody. And again, just like the operating rule book and the timetable, it's all in effect on what date? May 1st, all right. Nobody's going to get that test question wrong. Ross made me change it the other day, so we'll make sure. Okay, the timetable, again, effective May 1st. Again, we talked about the historic application, how it's an extension of the rules. If something gets changed in the rules or something that's not addressed in the rules, it's addressed in the timetable special instructions. Clarifies any changes, provides information regarding train operations, equipment restrictions, track locations. If you look at that and you look at the general notices, it talks about all kinds of things. It talks about how to do things and basic stuff for air brake tests. It talks about, above that, it talks about our radio channels. Above that, under the time card, it talks about our maximum speeds. It gives you a lot of information in here and how to do things that are just specific and unique to certain locations on the railroad. And again, it's primarily for operating personnel, but it's available to all. They're kind of fun to have. Is anybody a timetable collector? I'm a collector of employee timetables. I love them because they tell all kinds of information historically how railroads ran their trains. They're fascinating to me. But I'm a geek that way. Okay, now we're going to have some key definitions. And I'm going to ask for some class participation because I don't want to have to keep putting my glasses on to look these definitions up. So who wants to go find the definition? This is going to be in the operating maintenance away air brake and train handling rule book. There's a glossary in there. Somebody want to volunteer to look up the meaning or the definition of cars? This gentleman right here. Did you find it in there? Did you find it? Go ahead.
Railroad cars include all locomotives, freight, passenger cars, and other rolling equipment.
Cars, they include all locomotives, freight, passenger cars, and other rolling equipment. Not maintenance away stuff, but locomotives, passenger cars, freight cars. Those are cars. Also sometimes known as rolling equipment, means the same thing. So when you see in the rules, when we talk about cars, you know that definition applies. Okay? Who wants to look up clearance point? You got that? All right, speak up loud.
The location closest to a switch where it is safe for equipment and a person riding the side of equipment unless prohibited to pass equipment onto adjacent track. to an adjacent track.
To an adjacent track. We'll visualize that in a minute, but it's basically at those places where a track comes off of another track called a switch. You want to be able to push a car or whatever well into the clear so a passing train doesn't run into it. We'll visualize that here in a minute. How about a crew member? This is an important one. Who's got that one there, sir?
Conductors, brakemen, engineers, firemen, hostlers, and switchmen.
All right. And basically, a crew member is somebody that is part of the train or engine crew that's involved in moving locomotives and trains. So when you see that term used in the rules, that's who they're referring to. Next one, an engine. All right.
A unite problem by any form of energy or more than one of these unite operate from a single control. Engines are used in train or yard service. Track cars, speeders, cop cars are not engines.
All right, very good. Engines are basically locomotives used to pull the train. It could be a combination of them together, but a locomotive is an engine. And it's very specific in the rules. When we talk about maintenance away equipment, those are not engines. Okay. Track foreman, where'd he go? We have one. That's the guy who wants to read that definition real quick. Yeah, tell me what you got to do. Anybody want to read that one? Oh, you got it. I'm sorry, sir.
Rules qualified person in charge of personnel working on train.
All right, that's him. Rules qualified. That's why he's in this class. So he's going to understand it the same way that everybody else does. Okay? Okay, we talked about a clearance point. This comes up in various places in the rules, and I don't know how good of a job I did here on this illustration, but looking from the top down, this is what's known as a turnout or a switch, actually. Here's an engine going down straight. Here is the track coming off of that straight track. Here is a car parked here. See this X here? That is approximately the clearance point where this engine isn't going to run into this car, because this car is pushed down far enough to get out of the way, to be out of the way. If it gets too close, like say this end of it was parked here, this engine's going to corner it, hit it.
Said I do believe we've knocked the rear off the locomotive that way.
Yeah. If you do that, you're not in the clearance point, are you? And if you're hanging on the side of that car, it's even worse. So clearance points, whether you're, in my mind, whether you're in operating or not, you need to understand that being in the clear is important. But this is how it is applied to the rolling equipment or the cars on the switches. Fouling. Now this is not defined in your rule book. And it's a railroad term. A lot of the guys when I was just at Great Smoky Mountain, they kept telling me, I kept talking about fouling, don't foul the track. And they kept saying I was using too much foul language to back off. But fouling the track in general means that if you're within 4 feet of the nearest rail, you're too close to the track, okay? And we talk about, I think you'll see in some of these cardinal safety rules, if you don't need to be anywhere near the track for any reason, don't be near it. And I know we only run one train occasionally. We know where it is, but if you start trying to justify that it's okay for you to foul the track when you don't need to, it's not in the performance of your duties, you're just setting yourself up when we are running a lot of trains and we are busier, which we hope to be. Let's get in the practice now, not just for ourselves, but for all our co-volunteers and people we work with. If you get too close to the track, you're just not in a good place. To this day, just because I'm weird and my brain's all washed up with this stuff, I'll be at a museum with a disconnected track and I still don't like standing anywhere near it. I just can't. I even Even, I'm embarrassed to say, with some of the railroads I work with in my own company, I sometimes have to say, guys, while we're having this conversation, why don't we just step over here and have it? We don't need to stand in the middle of the track to have this conversation. So it's something to just start being aware of. No matter if you're in train operations, car host, volunteer, if you don't need to be near the track, get away from it. If you got to be there to perform your duties, that's different. But that's what fouling means. If you're in the foul, it means you're too close to the track. Close enough where you'll not clear the movement of a passing train. Any questions on that? That is not in the book. It's just something I wanted to talk about because I thought it was important. Okay, now we're going to get into the operating rules. Basic stuff. We're not going to go through all of it. We're going to go through basic things. When you go into the first chapter, this is stuff that all you BNSF guys, you guys that work for the railroad, you see all these same rules in all the same rule books. And it's been around for so long, and it still means the same today as it did 50, 60, 100 years ago. General responsibilities. Safety is the most important element in performing duties. Obeying the rules is essential to job safety and continued service. 1.1. That is, I believe, a cardinal safety rule. 1.1.1. Maintaining a safe course. In case of doubt or uncertainty, always take the safe course. If you're not too sure what to do, what's the safest thing I could do? It could be maybe not doing anything and go ask Ross before I do it, or somebody else that has more knowledge. Don't think, well, this is close enough where I don't want to embarrass myself. That's when you start getting into trouble. And 1.23 is for the operating folks, the inspection of freight and passenger cars. The idea is if you're assigned as a train crew, locomotive engineer, that it's your responsibility to do a cursory inspection of that equipment in addition to the regular air brake inspection to make sure it's safe to use. Common sense stuff. So that whole first chapter, that 1.0 chapter, that's what it has to do with. Just common sense. That's why I'm not going to read it to you, because I think we all have common sense when we do this kind of work. You'll see that the chapter S-1.0 in the safety rule book is very similar. Kind of says the same thing. The language might be a little different, but the message is exactly the same. Now we're going to get into the wonderful world of hours of service. How many of you guys, raise your hand again, all the people that are in operating or training to be in operating. Engineers, brakemen, firemen. Okay, this is all for you guys. The rest of you still need to listen because there's a couple of simple questions on the test. But this is primarily for you operating guys. One of the things that the Abilene and Smoky Valley does have to do is comply with the federal hours of service laws. It's not that complicated. The way you operate, it's even less complicated. So I'm going to try and get the mystery out of it for the way you have to do it. Training on how to do this is also required. So because I'm doing this training and Ross and Amy are documenting this stuff, that's the record that we have conducted the training as per the requirements of the FRA. And it's really easy for you guys. It's really simple because you have such a simple operation. 1.14 in your rule book, in the operating rule book, just says, when conducting service as an engineer, fireman, conductor, brakeman, switchman, even for a very short time, even just, I got to move this engine from here to here, that brings you into the hours of service. And then it talks about commingled service, which kind of gets people confused. But basically, if you're working down at the shop and you sweep floors from 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock, and then somebody wants you to move an engine from 3 to 4, you have just performed commingled service. You spent the majority of your day sweeping floors, but you were involved in what we call covered or hours of service for just a short time. Now that brings your whole day under the hours of service. And it doesn't make any difference whether you move the engine or operate the engine or gave a signal to move the engine or whatever it was at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day. Once you've done it, everything sucks into that hours of service. That's called commingled, and we'll talk about that in a minute. These are the key things. If you're working under 12 hours, less than 12 hours in covered service, you have to have at least 8 hours rest before you can come back and do it again. If you work 12 hours or over, which you should never, ever, ever, ever do, then you have to have at least 10 hours of rest. And then if you work 6 consecutive days, you have to have a minimum of 48 hours rest. But again, that'll be something that you will hardly ever have to worry about. The big thing you have to keep in mind is don't work 12 or more hours. I mean, you might get right up to 12, but no more than that. Because when you do that, you're violating the hours of service and the Railroad Safety Act, and then we got to report it to FRA and all that kind of stuff. Now, we're not talking about seconds and we're not splitting hairs. If you end up having to work 12 hours and then go into the engine house and it takes you another 5 minutes to fill out any paperwork or report, that's okay. We're just talking about, well, yeah, it's 12 hours, but I want to work another 30 or 40 minutes because I want to get this work done. That's what you can't do. That's what you can't do. Yes?
On the 48 hours of rest, is that consecutive 48 or 48 during a 6-day period?
I'm sorry,
48 hours of rest, is that consecutive hours or 48 hours during the 6 days?
It's consecutive. It's consecutive. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. I don't want to talk too much about it because you'll hardly ever have to worry about it, if ever at all. But I want you to make sure how to understand how to record it correctly in the record so that we'll have clean records. But yeah, good question. It's consecutive. Consecutive. Okay. The FRA and the government and all their wisdom, they put together, back in the day, I'm trying to remember when it was, 1912 or 1910, railroads just worked everybody until they dropped, and then they worked them some more. There was no limitations. And that, as you can imagine, the fatigue issues and things like that caused a lot of safety problems. By the turn of the other century, Congress came out with a law saying, you can't work these railroad covered service engineers, conductors, all that, more than 16 hours. If you work them up to 16 hours, they have to have at least 12 hours rest. And they came up with these basic rules. As time went by, the 16 went to 14 hours. Then it went to what it is today, 12 hours. So it dropped down. They call it, for you historians, they'll call it dying on the law or that type of thing. When you get to 12 hours, you're dead on the law. You can't work anymore. And that's how that works. The requirements by Congress, they didn't change that law for a long, long time. They told the FRA that, well, you got to put together regulations on how to keep this record keeping. Of course, they made it as complicated as they could. And then a few years ago, for various reasons, Congress changed the law to put in more about consecutive service days and things like that to help the Class 1 freight railroads was the big part. But the thing is, it didn't affect us at all. They kept anything regarding passenger rail, which included operations like this, still basically, with a couple exceptions, is the old time hours of service law, which is still pretty easy to understand. So it works out pretty good for us. And they don't distinguish about whether you're an employee or not. They're specific in the regulation that railroads like this, they say including train employees who are engaged in tourist, scenic, historic, or excursion rail passenger transportation. That's us. That's Durango, that's Great Smoky Mountain, that's you guys. FRA does not distinguish between train employees or volunteers regarding this law and the requirements for record keeping. Whether you're getting paid or not is irrelevant to the FRA. It's the task you're performing. If you're performing a task as an operating person, engineer, conductor, brakeman, fireman, that type of thing, that is involved in the movement of a train, we fall under this. I believe this is the record that you guys are using. It's pretty straightforward and simple. It's got a place for your name, the month, the year, and then the date over on the left column. It's probably hard for you guys to see, but that date in the left column, one piece of paper should cover a whole month, is the idea, or at least for as often as you guys are going to be performing covered service. If for some reason you'd fill up this piece of paper, you just get another one and make it a second sheet. But it's not complicated. The hardest part about doing this is just remembering to fill it out. That's the hardest part. You got some of those up there? All right. You pass those out. So covered service, when you hear that term, that means train employees, engineers, conductors, brakemen. If they're involved in the movement of a train in those positions, that means you're involved in covered service. That's the portion of the employees or the volunteer's time on duty during which the employee is engaged in or connected with the movement of a train. That's what brings you into it. Commingled service. That means for a train employee or a volunteer, any non-covered service that you do for the Abilene and Smoky Valley that is not separated from covered service by those off-duty times. In other words, the floor sweeping thing. You come in, you sweep floors from 8 to 4 or 8 to 3, and then you run a locomotive for another hour. That's commingled service. You didn't have any rest time. If you came in and started at 8 and you swept floors until 3, then you went home for 8 hours and came back, you're gold. You can run engines again, type of deal. So it's basically making sure you've got enough rest before you perform the movement of a train.
Mike, under that scenario, if you did that commingled service, like you were saying, what time should you show your on duty time? Would that be 8 in the morning or would that be 3 o'clock in the
That would be 8 in the morning. And we'll have a graphic here that illustrates that. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to explain, to comply with what we're required to do, but to not confuse everybody, because I can kind of tell that if I'm not careful, I'm just going to mix everybody up. The bottom line is, if you're involved in the movement of a train, you just need to pretend that everything you did that day was part of it. And you need to have enough rest before you come back and perform any of that type service again. That's what I'm trying to get across. And this is how we record it. A duty tour, that means the total of all periods of covered service and commingled service for a train employee occurring between those off-duty periods. So if you come to work at 8, you sweep floors for till 3, and then you operate a locomotive for 1, that is your tour of duty. From the time you started sweeping floors to the time you were completely done with all service, that's your tour of duty between those 2 points. Does that make sense? Then you start your off-duty period, which in most cases can't be less than 8 hours. The prior time off, which is a identifier in the record, means the amount of time that you have been off before you start service. So like volunteers, well, let's see if it'll be easier to explain it here when we get to the example. A train employee, again, anybody that's involved or connected with the movement of a train. Our maintenance away friend back here, he throws switches day in and day out. That doesn't mean he's involved and connected with the movement of a train. He's working on track, getting maintenance away machines on and off and out of the way. That's got nothing to do with train movement. People that are throwing switches to comply with blue signal protection or things like that, mechanical people, they're not involved in the movement of a train. But if I go throw a switch and then look at Ross and say, okay, bring it to me. I just got involved in the movement of a train. And who's ever running the engine like Ross, he just got involved in the movement of a train. So that's what brings us into it. The idea is anybody that's moving that big stuff around needs to be relatively rested. I'm not going to talk all about type 1 assignments or type 2 assignments because it's highly unlikely you'll ever be working after midnight here. I hope. If you do, then we'll figure that out. Ross and I will get together and fill out how to fill out your record. Basically what that is that on commuter railroads and Amtrak, where you might work a shift between 10 o'clock in the afternoon well into 4 in the morning, that kind of screws up with your sleep cycles, and they have a little bit different requirements for that. I just put it here because it's part of what's required by the hours of service training, but we don't need to worry about it. Again, you can't be on duty beyond 12 hours. If you are, you have to have at least 10 consecutive hours of rest. Anytime under 12 hours, you have to have 8, at least 8. Those are test questions. It's real simple. 12, you have to have 10 hours rest. Under 12, you have to have 8 hours rest. Don't work over 12. You can work up to 12, but not over 12. This consecutive calendar day series, I'm only going to briefly discuss it because, again, I don't want to confuse you. It doesn't apply that much here. For you guys on the BNSF and the work the Class 1 railroads know that for a long time, a railroader would go to work and he'd get off and he'd go to work and he'd get off and he'd go to work and he'd get off and he'd go to work and he'd get off and he'd go to, and it would just keep going and going and going and going. They would never be able to mark off and get any time off. So what the FRA did, because that started screwing with sleep cycles, they said, look, you can't work anybody more than 14 consecutive days. Now, you guys that are working on freight, it's different on freight. The freight hours of service is way different than this one. So that's not going to apply here. I can't imagine any time that you're going to be working 14 consecutive days. When this regulation came out, the Heritage Rail Alliance, which is the tourist railroad organization that represents all their members that are in the tourist railroad museum industry. We're kind of a unique bunch, not a whole lot of us out there. But when I was still with FRA, we got with the FRA hours of service specialist, we got with Heritage Rail Alliance, and we said, you know, this new rule that Congress just crammed down our throats is going to make it really hard for us Abilene and Smoky Valleys to try and figure out how to manage the record keeping and keep all the volunteers informed enough that they're not so confused that they can't fill out a record to comply with the federal regulation. And the FRA agreed. So they basically came out with that hours of service record that you're using. And the suggestion is that on railroads like this, and we do this in Durango and the Great Smoky Mountain as well, is that we never ever work usually more than 6 days in a row. Most of the time it's 5. And as long as that is always the case, you never have to worry about this consecutive day stuff. You just start over you might work 5 days, you're off for 2, you come back, and then that whole cycle starts over again. And the only thing you have to remember to do is document it on your record, and I'll show you how to do that. You don't need to worry about any of this other stuff. So here's an example of commingled service. You go here, you perform covered service. You're on duty at 8 o'clock. You work for an hour, moving a locomotive around up at the locomotive shop. Then you're back to sweeping floors, and you get off at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You're done. So everything from the time you started at 8, the time you started or ended at 4 o'clock, that's your total time on duty, which is 8 hours. Because you perform covered service here, all of this counts now. Does that visual help a little bit? Okay, let's look at it from the other end. You came on duty at 8 o'clock and you're sweeping floors down at the shop. Then, oh, I got to move a locomotive around. That just brought you into covered service. You're all done at 4 o'clock. Total time on duty is 8 hours. And to the gentleman's point back there, is your duty time started here at 8 o'clock. That's when your time started. Make sense? I probably should have had you print some of these out and pass them out if you haven't already, but here's an example of a log. Joe volunteer, it's the month of November, the year 2024. In this example, the date that the location primarily is always going to be Abilene. There might be a situation someday where you might have to go pick an engine up at Enterprise, but your on duty is still probably always going to be at Abilene. The date, 11/16 in this example, the C represents that you were a conductor on the passenger train. Your previous time duty, if you have had 24 hours or more, you can just put 24 plus. If you've had less than 24, try and be more accurate. Begin 14-day series. Yep, I haven't worked at all. So this will be my first day of a 14-day series. I just put an X there. On duty time at 8. I was released at 5. My total on duty time is 9 hours and my signature. I went to work the very next day on the 17th doing the same job. I had 15 hours off. This isn't the beginning of my 14-day series because these are 2 consecutive days. On duty at 8, off duty at 5, 9 hours, sign it. Then I didn't come back until November 23rd. As a switchman, E stands for engineer on a switch job. Again, it's been several days, 24 plus. This is my previous time off duty. I'm beginning that consecutive days over again because I've been off for several days. On at 8, off at 5, 9 hours, and sign it. I believe, Ross, we have examples of that around, so when these folks have to do this in real, they can reference this and go from there. So you really don't have to worry about the consecutive days unless you end up working 6 straight consecutive days. And then Ross will collect these, so it's important that you sign them. And if for some reason you have to work over 12 hours, say there's, God forbid, a mechanical issue and we got people out there and we're working trying to get them back and you end up working 12 and a half hours to make sure everybody returns home safely, document it specifically on here. You'll see down here in our agreement with the FRA, there's a check if excess hours of service and explain on the reverse side. So you need to explain it on the reverse of exactly why you had to exceed the hours of service. And for a guy that reviews records, please print so another person can read it. Because if the FRA can't read it, they're just going to start asking a bunch of questions. So, and that's on the reverse side. In fact, in this particular example, the individual, Joe Volunteer, that performed commingled service, he, on this final date right here, he was an engineer in commingled service. He was on an engine, but he was also working at the shop. So he indicated that ECM for commingled per the abbreviations down here. And then on the back, he put on 11:30 commingled shop work from 8 to noon, switch engine from noon to 5. Pretty clear. And then nobody's going to ask any questions. It just makes sense. Questions on this whole hours of service stuff. How many hours can you work in hours of service? Can't work more than what? 12 hours. If you do work 12 hours, how many hours do you have to have off? 10. If you work under 12, how many do you have to have off? Jeez. And if you are involved in the movement of an engine along with working in the shop, does that bring you into what kind of service? All right. And then everything counts, right? Okay, you guys got it. If I got that across, you're in good shape. You're in good shape. Radio rules, that's in your operating rules under 2.0. You'll also find the identical rule in the safety rules. And the reason it's in the safety rules, there might be people out there that have to use the radios that are not part of the operating department. That's why it's in there. I don't know how much you guys use radios. You've got one train primarily. Probably hand signals are probably the most common thing that you do. Is that correct in that assessment? Unless it's at night. Okay, you have lanterns though if you need them. Or, yeah. The point is, if you do use radios, you need to use them correctly. In my time, when I was training brakemen at the Grand Canyon Railway back in the day, and those guys, those young guys, they couldn't wait to get a hold of that radio. They really wanted to get that radio. And I go, no, you're not going to touch the radio until you can prove to me you can effectively use hand signals during the day and night. And they would have to do that. On that railroad, like this railroad, it's pretty simple. I mean, we've got usually one train and one crew. And so people using hand signals during the day, lantern signals at night, we'll talk about that here in a little bit. That works pretty good. You've got the radio there as the redundancy if you need it. And that's how you do it. But the radio you have to use correctly. I find that more people get in trouble with the radios than anything else, because pretty soon the radio gets to be like a cell phone instead of a radio. And then everybody's using it for what is not intended for railroad operations. And then people start getting a little lax. Instead of bring it back 3742, 2 cars to a joint, hey Fred, come on back. That's not good radio communication. So we're just going to talk a little bit about this. I'm going to count on that the senior people that have been here, Ross, you guys that have come off the class ones, that you can help mentor some of these younger folks on proper radio communication when they have to use it correctly. But this is where the rules are. So in Rule 2.0, 2.1 transmitting, any personnel operating a radio must do the following. Before transmitting, listen long enough to make sure the channel's not being used. See that all the time. Get the radio out and I just start talking. I don't listen for a minute to make sure I'm not going to walk on somebody that is already talking. So be patient, take a minute, listen. Give the required identification. Usually, if you're on a train and you're, say, on the locomotive, conductor, engine 403, conductor, train 403, engineer 403. Not, hey, Mike, this is Mike. Over? No. Who is it that's transmitting? And what position are they on that train crew? And then don't proceed with further transmission until acknowledgement is received. That's the whole deal. If I say this is engineer to conductor train 401 over, and then I just don't start talking again. I got to wait for that conductor to respond that he acknowledged that communication. Like, this is conductor 401 over. Then we can start talking. Again, this is pretty common sense stuff, but I see it misused all the time. So the radio rules, other than that, because you only use them at certain times, I'm going to count on you to read that part of the rule and understand how to do it, use it appropriately. Since you use primarily hand signals, but you've got guidance here, I'm not going to read these rules to you on the radio rules. If you, at the end of a transmission, you say over. When the whole conversation is complete, you say out, use proper identification. That's the big thing. Another big thing is that if you're using a radio on a movement where the locomotive is shoving a bunch of cars, and you're the eyes of the engineer back there talking to him on the radio because he can't see where he's going. You're the one back there that is seeing where the train's going and telling the engineer to slow down, to speed up, to stop, that type of thing. You have to communicate with him to make sure that he's got an idea. You're his eyes, like tracks clear to such and such street, 5 cars. Tracks clear, 3 cars. 2 cars to a stop, stop. If he doesn't hear anything from you, if you've given say a 4-car count, length of a railroad car, and he doesn't hear from you in 2 cars, he's just going to stop. And that's what's required by the rule. You just can't assume that guy's still back there. And the guy back there, he is the only eyes that engineer has. So that communication is important. Timetables. We already talked about the timetable. The moment the new one goes into effect, it will replace the previous one. So the orange one that we got now, number 12, on May 1st, it's going to replace number 11. If you're still carrying that around, that'll become a collector's item. You can put that in your antique case after that. It'll be a collector's item. Notice a new timetable at least 24 hours before a new timetable goes into effect. Notification will be made by general order. And I believe Ross passed those all out. You got those general orders in front of you? That's how you know a new timetable's coming out on May 1st. That timetable and special instructions will replace any rule or regulation with which they conflict. So anything in that timetable, that is the final gospel. So if there's any modifications, and there won't be because that timetable just introduced this brand new, or general order just introduced these brand new rules. So there should not be any conflict. But if something comes down over the next few years, well, Ramsey didn't know what he was talking about. We need to change this rule. Ramsey, you screwed up on this one. This one doesn't make sense for Abilene and Smoky Valley. And those will all be coming out on general orders to make those modifications. And then after a few years, after Ross has a stack of general orders like this, he's going to go, it's probably time to make a new timetable. And then we'll start this process all over again. Not necessarily with new rule books, but to update everything in the timetable that will be the extension of the rule book. Signals. Again, all this stuff is in the book, all in chapter 4. We're going to talk about some of these, but not all of them. Receiving and giving signals, hand and radio signals, flags for temporary track conditions. Basically, just in general for you operating guys and the non-operating guys, if the engineer sees a yellow board, the rule is telling him, oh, there's a track condition up here I have to slow down for. And it's going to be, I don't know what our distance is. Oh, right at the restriction? Okay, so where that yellow board is, I've got to slow way down. And usually Ross will tell you what that speed is. So it's not as, because of this type of operation, and we all talk to each other all the time, it's not as formal as what you're going to see on the BNSF, but you'll know about it. So anyway, those are an example of a signal. Of course, a red board, what's that mean? Stop. Red board, red flag. You'll hear this term board and flags used interchangeably. We don't care what the material is made out of. It's what it's displaying. If it's a red flag, it means the same thing as a red board. Red is red, stop is stop. When it's a wayside deal stuffed in the ballast out there. Hand and radio signals, do you guys use the Western go away, come to me signals? You need to get consistent on that, or at least agree with crew what you're going to do. Yeah, during the day, and then at night you use the standard lantern signals. Okay. Just again, a quick history lesson. Historically, and in most rule books, there's a standard hand signal for going ahead and a standard hand signal for backing up, whether it's day or night. But somewhere probably about 60, 75 years ago, Most of the Western railroads modified that for their own use. And basically, if Ross is the engineer and I want him to come to me, and it doesn't make any difference which way that locomotive is pointing, I'm going to go this way. That's come to me, and he'll come this way. Doesn't make any difference which way that locomotive is pointing, where the front of it is. It's come towards me. If I want him to go away from me, I'll tell him to go away, and he'll go that direction. At night, that's tough, because at night you can't see that. He can't tell what my arms are doing, so I have to use a light. So now it does make a difference at night which direction the locomotive is pointing. So if the locomotive is pointing that direction and I want him to go that way, I'll take my lantern and I'll go like this. And he's just going to see that light going up and down, which means go forward based on the direction of the locomotive. If I want him to back up at night, then I'll take my lantern and I'll do this. And then he'll back up. But during the day, most Western roads use the standard to go away from me, come to me. Because they're easy to see, they're pretty intuitive. But whatever you do as a crew, you operating folks, if you get together, just decide what signals you're going to use and then stick with them during that tour. Okay? Stop signal is always this. If you got a lantern in your hand, stop. And again, there's illustrations in your roll book on how all those work. You've got enough senior people around here, you volunteers, your new guys, they're going to go over that stuff with you. We won't take the time here to do it. Bell and whistle signals, that's pretty standard for crossings. When you're getting ready to move, when you stop, you guys still sound the whistle once you've made the stop and you're staying put. That means, okay, we're not going to move again until somebody tells us to. If I'm going to give Ross a go-ahead signal and he's going to move the locomotive forward in the direction it's pointing, it's going to be toot, toot. If I tell him to back up, it's going to be toot, toot, toot. Those types of thing. Anytime before a locomotive train moves, the bell will get rung to warn everybody, hey, we're getting ready to move. Highway rail grade crossings, two longs, a short and a long whistle with the bell ringing. That's the requirement. Again, this is all in the book. Headlight display, particularly since we have public highway rail grade crossings, should always be on. Going across those crossings should be on in the direction of movement. Markers to indicate the rear of the train. I don't know if you guys use kerosene markers or red flag or a combination of both. As long as you got something that says, hey, this is the end of my train, we didn't lose anything. So the whole idea of that marker at the rear is to indicate the rear of a train, that we didn't lose anything, that is it. And then if there was another train following, they'd be able to see that. And we'll talk about how that all works here in a minute. Blue signals are also a signal that means something, and we're going to get into that here right now. Okay, this is almost as exciting as hours of service, so bear with me. Blue signal, how many of you have worked in an industry where you have lockout, tagout requirements? Okay, this is lockout, tagout requirements for the railroad industry regarding cars and rolling equipment. That's all it's applied to, okay? In the railroad world, on bigger railroads that have main track, the tracks on a railroad are identified as one of two types. You've got the main track, which you have to have some kind of authority or protection to operate on. It's designated in your timetable special instructions, and then you got everything else. It's either the main track and it's everything else. Spurs, siding, auxiliary tracks, Ys, all that other stuff is other than main track or auxiliary track or everything else. At the Abilene and Smoky Valley, because you're a small operation, we only run primarily one train at a time. What you got there? Oh, your tags? Okay, we'll get. Okay, we'll get into that here in a second. So we only operate one train at a time. So instead of having a designated main track, because we just don't need one, we know that the track between here and Enterprise is our primary track, but we don't designate it as a main track because we don't need to have some kind of assigned authority to operate on it. We can move around out here at will, prepared to stop short, not to run into each other. So this whole railroad is considered other than main track. We don't have a main track per the rule. We just have other than main track. Yeah, the track between here and Enterprise is a primary track that we operate on. But by rule, for authority and to protect ourselves, we just call it all other than main track. And the reason I explain that is because in blue signal protection, they talk about how to protect yourself on main track, and they talk about how to protect yourself on other than main track. So I need to understand what those two mean. And we've got a special instruction here we'll read to you in a minute as far as protection. So the idea here for you new guys is if you're gonna crawl underneath a locomotive or a car, get on top of a locomotive or a car, get in between a locomotive and a car, as a mechanical person to do mechanical work, you kind of want to make sure that thing doesn't move while you're under there. That's kind of the whole idea. I don't want to get underneath this if it's going to move. So these blue signals are the indication and how you set them up to make sure it doesn't move. Okay? The majority of the time, the blue signals are going to be important down at the mechanical shop. Occasionally, depending on what you're doing here in front of the depot at Abilene or down at Enterprise, as a mechanical person, not an operating person, but a mechanical person, you may need to provide blue signal protection. You may not. It just depends on what you're doing. Operating people that are assigned to that train as an engineer, fireman, conductor, and brakeman, they don't need blue signals. Why do you think they don't need blue signals if they have to get underneath the train? Any idea on that? What's that? I'm sorry? They operate. They're in the control of their own movement of their own train. So if Ross is the engineer and I'm the conductor, and I say, Ross, I got to go in between these cars to hook up these two air hoses, I'll either give them a signal or I'll talk to him on the radio because I'm in charge of the movement of that train and he won't move it until I tell him to. I should be okay. We're train crew. We're not mechanical people. We're not mechanical people. But then if somebody else shows up and says, hey, Ramsey said that there's a bad air hose, I need to replace the air hose between these two cars. Well, he's not a part of the train crew. He doesn't know whether that train's going to move or not. So he would provide blue signal protection for himself to make sure it doesn't, while he puts himself in a position where he's got to change that hose and be protected from any movement of that train. So that's the difference. That's why train crews, they're in control of their own movement. They don't need to worry about it. So when you're a workman, when they in the blue signal rule, they have a definition of a workman, and that is Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad personnel. Remember, we talked about what personnel meant way back at the beginning of the class on that definition. Assigned to inspect, test, repair, or service railroad rolling equipment or components, including the brake systems. Train and yard crews are excluded for the reasons we just explained, except if they go work on another train. You don't have to worry about that. We only have one train. The rule talks about that if there's another train over here and they say, okay, Mike, you're the conductor on train 1, but in the meantime, while you're waiting around for Ross to get his act together, why don't you come over here and work on our train for us? Well, I'm not in charge of this train. I don't know who is. So now all bets are off. Rolling equipment, we know what that means. We talked about what cars being in the definition. Same thing, engines, cars, one or more engines coupled to one or more cars. Blue signal, during the day, a clearly distinguishable blue flag or light, and at night, a blue light. During the day, it could either be a light or a flag, but at night, it's got to be a light. Do we have blue lights? Nope. You need them very much at night, you think? Probably I get some. Those magnetic flashlights are the most compact ones, easy to use. An effective locking device, when used in relation to a manually operated switch or derail, a lock that can be locked or unlocked only by the individual or group of workmen applying the lock. Basically, all that means is if I'm a mechanic working down at the shop and I'm working with Ross and Joe and the rest of the guys, and we're going to start crawling underneath the steam locomotive down there, I want to make sure that nobody comes inside that shop and couples to that steam locomotive. So I'm going to walk down to that turnout or that switch that has access into the shop. I'm going to line it to make sure that that track can't be used. And I'm going to put a lock on it that only Ross and I and the mechanical people have a lock to. Then I'm going to put a blue flag up, and that's going to tell everybody, hey, you can't come down this track. There's people underneath this equipment down here. That's what it means. I'm not going to get into a designated engine and car repair service area because we don't have one here, so I'm not going to talk about it. That makes basically a designated areas. In Durango, we have one, and that gives a little bit more latitude for mechanical employees to move equipment around under blue signal protection, but that's a big servicing area. You guys don't need that. The switch providing direct access, that's the one that if used by rolling equipment and will permit other rolling equipment to roll into it. That's a switch providing direct access. That's the turnout thing where we talked about clearance points and all that stuff. A blue signal signifies that workmen are on, under, or between rolling equipment and requires that rolling equipment can't be coupled or moved. Rolling equipment must not pass the blue signal on that track protected by the signal. Rolling equipment must be placed on the same track so to block or reduce the view of that signal. And rolling equipment must not enter the track when a blue signal is displayed on the entrance to that track. That blue signal says stop. Somebody's working on this equipment, whether it's down this track or on this locomotive. Somebody's working on it. Back up, caution, we can't couple into it. All the Abilene and Smoky Valley operating personnel performing mechanical work, the people are out there primarily doing mechanical work or can do mechanical work, that requires blue signal protection will also display their personal ID tag or check to the blue signal display to identify who initially placed the blue signal and identify those working under the specific signal. That's these things here. And Ross will distribute those to the people that need them, and they'll have you say they'll stamp their name in it, or it'll have your initials stamped in it. So the way this works, as an example, say the train's sitting out here in front of the depot, and Ross and I are mechanical people. There's no crew assigned to that train yet, but Ross and I have to do some work on it. So Ross comes down there and he goes, man, I got to get underneath this last car on the train and adjust the brakes. So he's going to go up to the engine and he's going to hang a blue signal up there. And he's going to flag himself out appropriately for the track it's sitting on, with a flag at one end of the train and a flag at the other end of the train. And then he's going to hang his tag on that one up on the engine. Then I come along later. Well, I need to do something else. And I'm looking to put my blue signals up and I go, wait a minute. There's already blue signals up. I wonder who did that. So I go up to the engine, I look up there and I see Ross's tag hanging there. And I go, oh, Ross is out here. He's already doing something. So I'll go ahead and take my tag out and I'll hang it up there. So now we got two tags hanging up there. We got two people working on that train. In the meantime, I'm doing something in the engine room of the locomotive. Ross comes back. He's all done with his work back on the train. And he's going to take his blue signal down and he goes up to get his tag and go, oh, somebody else hung their tag here. Oh, Ramsey's up here working. I wonder where he's at. Well, I'll leave it all alone. He's still protected. Does that make sense? Now you can see for this all to work, everybody's got to do it properly. If one person doesn't do it, then the whole system collapses. That's why it's important. In my time, all my years as a field inspector and working for the railroad, I can count at least a dozen, fortunately just very, very close calls where people got hurt, no fatalities, fortunately for me, regarding improper or failure to comply with blue signal protection. And that's everything from big class 1 railroads to real simple railroads like this one. Most of the ones happen to simple railroads like this one. So you really have to be vigilant. And if you're not too sure, you're going to do what? Take the safe course. Remember that rule way back when? Page 24 or 44. Yeah, about halfway in the middle where it says main track for the purposes governing. Okay, now, again, just to confuse you some more, we all determined that there is no main track on this railroad. Everything's other than main track. But this particular rule, designed just for the Abilene and Smoky Valley to make life a little easier in certain situations, is that when you're sitting in front of the depot here, or you're sitting in front on the track down there at Enterprise, and if you have to use blue signal protection, for the purposes of blue signal protection, you'll set those blue signals up like it is on the main track. It just makes it a simpler process and still provides you the protection that's needed. So that's the only place main track is mentioned. We're not saying it is main track. We're just saying that when you have to use blue signal protection, you use the main track rule on how you set those signals up. Have I confused everybody completely now? And maybe we can make sense of that. But on Abilene and Enterprise loading tracks only, as per the rule, a blue signal must be displayed at each end of the rolling equipment. So if somebody from mechanical comes over, a blue signal goes at the controls of the locomotive, one goes at the end of the engine, whether it's in the knuckle of the engine or clipped to the rail, or we don't care as long as it's at the end. And then down at the other end of the train, at the caboose, or whatever the last car is, another blue flag. That's all you got to do, along with your tag, which would go on the one at the locomotive. It's all you got to do in that situation. But only in these scenarios, Enterprise for loading. If you have to get underneath the train to work on it, that's going to put you in a position that if it moves, you're going to get hurt or killed, and you have to put blue signal protection up, you use this in those two locations. Everywhere else is other than main track or auxiliary track. The shop is, to me, is the primary one that I can think of. And that's where you've got a line, you've got one switch going into one track at the shop or two tracks in the shop. One. So that furthest switch out that provides access into the shop, that's the one that you will line against whatever track you're working on. Put your blue flag up at the clearance point. Remember where the clearance point is? You put your flag up there. It might be a flag that's in between the rails. It might be a flag that clips to the rail. I don't know what you have. Clamp onto the rail. And then it's at the clearance point. And then you go back and you verify that the switch, you're working on this track, and that locomotive over here, the switch is lined to go down this track. Then you take that effective locking device out of your back pocket and you put it on there with the switch lock or in place of the switch lock. That way, if somebody like me that wants to run an engine in there comes down and I go, well, I'm going to jump down here and I'm going to unlock the lock and I'm going to go right on in there, I won't be able to. I'm going to say, well, who put this lock here? And I'm going to look up, and what am I going to see down at the clearance point? Oh, I can't go in here. Somebody's working on that equipment down there and I don't want to kill them. That's how it works. If it's a track that's got two switches like a siding, do we have a complete siding anywhere here on this railroad? So if you got sidings where you've got a switch at each end, you're doing the same thing, you're just doing it at both ends. And if you happen to have a locomotive on the equipment that you're working on, you still have to put a blue flag at the controls of that locomotive because you don't want somebody climbing up in that engine and moving it. I don't expect you to grasp all this completely today, but you've got good illustrations and a rule book where you can reference it. If you're not too sure, you've got a lot of senior folks around here that will be able to help you through it. All I ask is that if you are assigned to do some mechanical work on a piece of equipment, before you do anything other than, yeah, I'll do that, is step back and go, okay, how am I protected before I do this to make sure that this equipment won't get moved? And if you got to pull out your rule book to look it up, fine. Just don't jump underneath there without considering how that equipment might move. We don't have any fixed derails here, do we? Okay, fixed derails, they're a device that allegedly will derail a car. I find with derails, when you want them to work, they don't, and when you don't want them to work, they do. But you can use that in place of a switch to put your lock on, but we don't have any of those, so we won't talk about it, but it's the same idea. We won't talk about car and engine servicing areas because there's none designated on this railroad. We'll go right by that. Emergency repair work. A blue signal is not available for performing emergency repairs under or between an engine or rolling equipment coupled to an engine on the track between Abilene and Enterprise. The personnel controlling the engine must be notified and appropriate measures taken to provide protection for the personnel. What this rule is saying is, say the train's going between here and Enterprise and everything's fine, and then all of a sudden we have a mechanical problem and we have to stop. And Ross forgot to make sure that we had any blue flags on the train. And I'm the engineer, and you got to crawl underneath this thing and work on it. You need to make doggone sure so that you don't have any blue signals available. And you got to crawl underneath this thing. You got to make sure that me and Ross, but particularly me as the engineer, you communicate with me and say, Mike, don't you dare move this train. Don't you dare move this train. Set the brakes, don't do anything. Yes, sir. The radio would be a way to provide that means of communication. The thing is, in this situation on your railroad, because you can provide basic compact blue lights and signals, you should not ever get into that situation. But if you do, this is the rule that allows you to repair what needs to be repaired. Does that make sense? This is an emergency situation. It's not, and blue flags aren't available. Blue flags should be available. On this type of an operation, they should be available. You're not that complicated. So as far as blue signals go, it's real simple. You've got a special rule for Enterprise and for here on the loading tracks that if you have to blue flag for whatever reason, you can do it the simple way with a blue flag at each end and one of the controls of the locomotive. Any place else, you have to lock the switches out, put a blue signal up at the clearance point. And in both cases, you hang your identification tag. It's pretty simple, really. I just explained it in a complicated way because I worked for the government too long. They put me through training to do it that way, to take something simple and make it as complicated as I possibly could. So the idea is these blue signals protect your life. So you people are going to be doing mechanical work. Make sure you understand, or you talked about it, you make sure that you've got your protection set up properly. People that are in operating, why is it you don't have to do any of this? If you're assigned to that train as a crewman, why do you not have to do all this blue signal stuff? You're in control of the train. Now, don't get into the thing that I see on a lot of tourist railroads and volunteer museums is that, well, I'm a mechanical guy and I got to do work on this train. I got my mechanical hat on. Oh man, I got to get underneath this thing and I don't want to run all the way back to the shop and get those blue signals. Well, I'm going to put my operating hat on. I am now an assigned crew member. No, it's not the way it works. You're one or the other. You can't be both. You can't be both. Okay. Remember I told you that Abilene and Smoky Valley doesn't have any main track, right? Except for that convoluted blue signal part. But we don't have main track. We don't have centralized traffic control with automatic block systems and train orders and track warrants or anything like that is a system to move multiple trains over a primary piece of railroad that keeps them from running into each other. We don't need that because we only got one train, at most two. We don't have high speed 50, 60, 70 mile an hour track. We've got 10 mile an hour track and one train. So we don't need all those complications. So we look at this railroad as other than main track. And because of that, we move around at a speed known as restricted speed. So if you look at your timetable under General Notice number 1, who can read that for me? Somebody? All right.
All track on the Abilene and Smoky Valley Railroad is classified as other than main track. Trains or engines must move at a speed that allows stopping within half the range of vision short of train, engine, railroad car, men or equipment fouling the track, stop signal, derail, or switch lined improperly, or obstructions fouling the track.
Basically, we move around prepared to stop. We're going so slow that our sight distance should help us be able to stop within 1/2 the range of vision. We all move around, not running into each other. So like when we talked about blue signal protection on the loading tracks at Enterprise and Abilene, if that blue signal's hanging at each end, that blue signal means what? Stop, somebody's under it. It's a signal saying, don't couple into this. We already read the rule. We're going at restricted speed. I should be able to see that blue signal from a long ways away. And I'm going to stop when? 1/2 the range of vision. If we have two trains coming at each other at restricted speed, and they're truly going restricted speed, and they stop within 1/2 the range of vision, how far will those trains be away from each other when they stop? No, they'll still be quite a ways. They still have to stop with 1/2 the range of vision. They shouldn't get close to each other, theoretically. Theoretically. If it's snowing out and the visibility is even worse, the speed might be barely moving at all because your vision is now impaired even more. So restricted speed is critical for you engineers and for you conductors and trainmen that might be at the end of the train that's being shoved anywhere on this railroad. Because if you're the eyes for the engineer, now you have to make that 1/2 the range of vision judgment. And in no cases is it ever going to exceed 10 miles an hour because that's the maximum speed of the railroad, right? But in most cases, it's probably going to be under. It depends on the environmental situation and what you can see. If our maintenance away friends are out there working and you're going down this track and you see that yellow flag or red flag, you're going to see that and you're going to stop within 1/2 the range of vision if it's a stop requirement. Does that make sense? I can't tell you how important it is to be able to stop within 1/2 the range of vision. Most of the incidents that I have worked over the years with restricted speed violations, it was that somebody thought they could see farther than they really could because they really wanted to get to where they were going. So they talked themselves into going a little bit faster, and then they hit the jackpot, and then this happens. So restricted speed, you guys that are training and running, you just need to keep that in mind. This whole railroad is that way. This whole railroad's that way. Road crossings. Look at general notice number 5 in your timetable. This is rule 5.7. And then we got other special instructions. Could you read this for me, that one?
Movement of trains or engines across Main Street, K-43, at Enterprise and Buckeye Street, K-15 at Abilene will be protected by a crew member on the ground flagging the crossing. This is in addition to the normal whistle and bell thing.
So rule 5.7 just talks about, in general, road crossings. You know, blowing the bell or blowing the whistle, ringing the bell. And then this special notice is a little bit more specific of what we want you to do at those specific locations. Road crossings, particularly, well, any of them for that matter, because we have, how many public road crossings do we have? A half dozen? Half dozen public and a whole bunch of private ones. Those are our potentially biggest risk for incidents because we have no control over the motoring public. So we have to be extra vigilant. If you're riding a locomotive or a car across a crossing, my recommendation is that you do not stand down on the steps. Get up on the locomotive, get up on the car, don't be on the steps. Because if somebody in the motoring public doesn't see and they fail to stop, you're in a very vulnerable position down there. So get up on the end of the platform, get in the vestibule, get in the car, get up on the locomotive. Don't be riding the steps like this. Does that make sense? I've unfortunately had to work 2 fatalities where trainmen have gotten killed because somebody failed to stop for whatever reason. They were distracted on their cell phone or looking at a map or whatever, and they slammed right into the side of the train where that guy was riding. I'm still struggling with the guys in Durango to not ride the rear of the tender across the public crossing there for that same reason. Any questions on road crossings? Do you have red flags for when you flag those crossings? Stop sign. Do you have high-vis vests? Okay, good. Okay, switching. 6.0, that's that chapter. You probably don't do a whole lot of switching. Your train's pretty much made up, but you probably do enough at times that you got to stop and think about what you're doing and how it's going to work. So switching, doing that, doing it safely and efficiently. Again, I'm not going to read you all of these rules that are all in the book. Precautions for coupling or moving cars or engines. Testing handbrakes, we're going to talk about that. Securing cars or engines. And charging your brakes. Each one of these cars and every locomotive has a manual handbrake on it, okay? One of the biggest things that we see in the industry is that, oh, I'm just gonna set this car out over here for a minute. I'll make a big set with our air brakes and it's not gonna go anywhere because I don't wanna climb up there and crank this handbrake. Well, it goes somewhere. It goes somewhere. I'm guilty of it. Grand Canyon Railway, I was told to set 3 passenger cars out on the siding. I tied every handbrake. I didn't chock it. I didn't test the brakes to make sure they would hold, and I went home. The next morning, my boss calls me and he says, "Where did I tell you to set those cars out?" "Well, they're on the siding at Williams." He said, "Well, they're not there now." Since then, they talk about you secure it if you're going to leave a train. So like say you're going to leave the train out here in front of the depot. You secure it by tying how many ever handbrakes you need. What's your practice here, Ross? 1? First car, end car, plus the locomotive? 1 car and locomotive. Once those are tied, you test it to make sure that it's not going to move. Usually it's by releasing the engine brakes and just giving it a little tug, and you could tell nothing's going to move. You're pretty level out here. There's not much of a grade. Now you know it's not going to go anywhere. And you're done. But you set it out, the engine house, you have to set a car out somewhere else. You need to make sure that everything's secure and nothing's going to move. because nothing makes your heart sink more like mine did when I was told that the cars I set out the night before weren't there anymore. And they crossed 2 public crossings in the middle of the night, no flashing lights or anything. We were lucky. We were lucky.
Wait, so if a car goes across the railroad crossing by itself, the arms won't go down?
If there are arms there. But the thing is, you got to remember, and that won't be an issue here, but those arms and lights are based on the speed. And usually it's on a railroad like this, it's a slow speed. If the cars are going real fast, by the time the crossing lights and gates realize there's a car coming, it's already through the crossing before they go down. But not every crossing has lights and gates. A lot of them don't. In fact, here, I don't think you don't have any. There are no active warning at any crossings here on this railroad. So those are things to think about. They had a incident on a railroad in Arizona where, again, they shortcut rules on verifying that the train wouldn't go anywhere while they switched out a car in the middle of the night, and the train left going down about a 2.3% grade, and it went for almost 33 miles. The top speed of the railroad, maximum authorized speed for trains was 35 miles an hour. They figured that a train got up to 70. Hazmat on it, crossed multiple highway rail grade crossings, public ones with active warning. The lights went like this, that's how fast it went through. Tried to make a curve in Holbrook, Arizona, going across the Little Colorado River. Didn't make it. Everything tipped over. All that hazmat broke open. They had to evacuate it. Millions of dollars worth of damage. All because the crew didn't want to take the time to secure it properly.
I've got one, Solomon is good. I was dispatching an MRL. My adjoining dispatcher had they were picking up unmanned helpers at Garrison, I believe. And the crew got off, they both got off the train, walked to get the unmanned helpers. They were going to stick them on the point. And he had bottled the air when he stopped. And so he had, as they were walking away, they looked back over their shoulder and they saw their 7,800 ton train starting down the mountain. And I believe it went 25 miles, went through 55 mile an hour siding at about 60. They finally derailed it, but the thing that really made it bad is because coming out of Missoula, you've got the Clark Fork River, you've got I-90, and you've got the railroad, and all kind of doing this, so you didn't really have a lot of choices. But we got a lot of phone calls about this train that was on the tracks, and the engines were still, the wheels were sparking a lot. Well, that was the only independent all that they had on the train at that point.
Yeah. And our cars have air brakes on them most of the time, on the passenger train here. The air brakes are always going to be used. We'll talk about that later. But when you're setting a car out and you've got the option of using the air brake to make sure it doesn't go anywhere, you can't depend on that air brake to always work. If you leave that car there with the air brake set on it, it's eventually going to leak off. It won't stay set forever. And if you don't have that handbrake tied and you've tested it by releasing the air brakes and testing the handbrake, that's the only way you can verify that that car is going to stay put. So those are one of those things that when you do that kind of work, you kind of, those spidey senses, let's make sure this thing doesn't go anywhere. But each car has at least one, and every locomotive, with the exception of the steam locomotive, has a handbrake on it as well. And like Ross says here, because the grade is very minimal, like out here in front of the depot, tying the locomotive handbrake and one of the cars is more than enough to keep it from going anywhere. But you still need to test it. The story I was telling you about at the Grand Canyon, where I thought that I had them all tied, it turned out that 2 of those 3 handbrakes of those cars, 2 of them didn't work because the bell crank was bottoming out on the end beam. It felt like it was tight to me, but it wasn't they weren't doing a thing. And I didn't test it because we didn't think about those things in those days. And that's why they rolled away. So that's why you have to test to make sure that that handbrake works so you don't get in trouble like I did. Okay, I think we've beat to death how important it is to make sure the cars don't roll away after you set them out. Test them. Switches. All of 7.0 in the operating rulebook has to do with switches. Position of switches, conflicting movements, approaching switches. Switches run through, that's where you go through a switch that's not lined in the direction that you're going, and then you damage the switch. And if you do that, the thing is to fess up and tell our maintenance away friend who won't be real happy with you. But it's better than trying to cover it up and then a train derails on it later. Okay. What I used to do is if I had one of my operating employees, if they screwed up and ran through a switch, and then I had to go deal with the roadmaster who was rightfully upset, and part of the retraining for the individual was he got to go help the roadmaster fix that switch and repair it. That way they got a little bit of idea what those guys have to go through when things like that happen. So we'll talk a little bit about that, damaged defective switches. For you new guys, and I don't know if this graphic helps, but you can see here how that switched over to that way. It's going to drop back. So here it's going this direction. This is the straight track. Now it's going this direction. Can you see how that works? Does that make sense to you new guys? Got that? You guys understand that over there? You new guys? That's how it works. So it's important that you can look at that and you understand where you're going, what route you're going to take, either straight or down the other side, this way or this way. So on switches, if you run through a switch, that means it's lined in this direction and you went this way and you messed up all these mechanics in here because they weren't lined in that direction. If you're a movement and you're going this direction, these things here are called the points, and you're facing those. So that's a facing point movement. You're either going to go this way or you're going to go this way. You can't hurt anything that way. It's you're going one way or the other. But if you're going this direction and the switch is lined that way and I go this way, it's going to bend all that stuff over and destroy those points. And then if I don't say anything or tell anybody, the next guy that's coming the other direction is going to derail on that.
Okay, so I was a dispatcher for 22 years, a couple different railroads. And one thing that I want you guys to understand, these rules are there for a purpose. And this is one instance. Just because you went over the industrial switch when you went to Enterprise and it was normal, don't make the assumption that it's going to be the same coming back. Apply the rules as the situation is in front of you. So just like Chuck said, if you're leaving at Abilene, make sure that switch is reversed when you pull out of the siding. When you come back, before you go head in, make sure it's reversed before you head in. There's no guarantee, since we're all other than main track, that somebody hasn't come along and moved that switch. Odds are it hasn't, but you can't make that assumption because you got 160 people on the train that are trusting you to do the right thing. So every time, treat it like it's the first time you've seen it. And that way, I won't have to yell at you.
Remember going back to restricted speed and that laundry list of items in there? What was one of those laundry list of items? Switch not properly lined or lined improperly. And Ross just explained that very well. Very well. Now, you new guys, and if you're out there, and I'm throwing a lot at you at a very short amount of time here, so I understand that. But for you new guys, don't be embarrassed. If you're out there and you're going, I think the switch is lined that way, and you're looking at it, and you're pretty sure you know which way it's lined, but you still haven't got the quite understand whether you figured out, don't be afraid to go ask somebody to make sure. Don't, well, I don't want to embarrass myself. No, take the safe course, verify that the way you're looking at it is correct, and then everybody's safe until you get used to it. None of these guys are gonna, these are a good bunch of guys around here. They're not gonna make fun of you or anything like that. We've got to watch out for each other. We just have to, especially on an operation like this. Any question on switches? You'll see a target out there. Most of them have a switch stand and you throw it, and there's a whole mess of rules in the safety rules of how to do that without hurting yourself. Screw your back up, use your legs and that kind of stuff. But you have targets on almost all your switch stands. Are they just red or green and red or? Okay, and the points are painted white. So if it's lined against normal movement, the target is red. When it's lined for normal movement, you won't see a target. It'll just be a straight line. But don't get in the habit of looking at that red circle target. Is that what they are, a red circle? And saying, oh, the target's red. Yeah, look at those white points. Put your eyes to those points and make sure that these are lined where they're supposed to be. The target gives you an indication, but verify that indication. We're going to go through some Air Brake 101. The next part of your rule book has to do with air brakes. We just got done talking about a very high level of the general operating rules. Again, there's more in there that I didn't go into detail on based on time, but I'm covering the key areas. Now we're going to go into a little bit of the air brake rules. First, to go into air brakes, you kind of got to understand, at least in general, how they work. I know a lot of you senior guys around here, you understand it completely. So this is for the new folks that need that basic understanding of Railroad Air Brake 101. Back in the day, in the early days, railroads didn't have air brakes. They had a lot of brakemen on the train, and they jumped from car to car, tying down those handbrakes when the engineer whistled for it. Very dangerous job. They had Lincoln pin couplers. They had to get in there and hope they could drop that pin before the link got their fingers and took them off. That's why we have a lot of things on trains today like automatic air brake systems, because it makes things much safer for everybody. So a current basic air brake, they developed a straight air brake, which is basically a compressor on the locomotive, a valve controlled by the engineer. The air went all the way back through the brake pipe and right into the brake cylinders, which were mechanical, and pushed the cylinder out, which pushed the shoes up against the wheel. That was great until the train broke in two. Then there was no air brakes at all. And then everything ran away. What they came up with later, George Westinghouse, was an automatic air brake system that is based on an air brake reduction. But what I did here in this illustration, I kind of pulled the brake line system away from the train so you could see it, how it would work on a normal train like yours out here. So the locomotive, whether it's a diesel or a steam locomotive, has got a compressor up there. And that compressor is pumping compressed air into a big reservoir tank that we call the main reservoir tank. And that main reservoir is providing air for use by the air brake system, okay? And what that air brake system does, the engineer's got controls up there where he can manipulate that system by reducing the air throughout this brake pipe, which goes from one end of the train to the other. These little U's here represent those air hose connections between the cars, okay? So underneath each car, there is another reservoir, a little auxiliary reservoir. There is we're just going to call it a brake valve for now, a valve underneath the car with the reservoir. And then there's the brake cylinder in there that mechanically pushes all the levers and clevises that mechanically brings those shoes up against the wheel to stop or slow down the train. So each car has a brake reservoir under it, a brake valve under it, a brake cylinder under it that connects to the shoes that go up against the wheels. Each car has one. So what happens is that the air compressor pumps up that main reservoir, and then it charges up this whole brake line from one end of the train to the other. Charges it all up, and then as it charges up each individual reservoir underneath each car. So between 70 and 90 is the brake pipe pressure. So once all of this is charged up and each reservoir underneath each car is charged up to whatever our required is, 70 or 90, the brakes are still released, but everything is charged with air. The brake line in each one of those reservoirs. So everything will move, we just got air underneath each one of those reservoirs. The engineer, with his brake valve up in the locomotive, he can make a movement on his brake valve that will reduce the air pressure in this whole brake line. He'll bring it down like, say, 5 pounds. He'll reduce it 5 pounds. When he does that, that brake valve, and this is a very simplified explanation, that brake valve underneath each car senses that air reduction, and when it does, it opens a other valve that allows air to go from each one of those reservoirs that's underneath each car, goes into the brake cylinder. When it goes into the brake cylinder, it pushes that piston out, and then that piston pushes all the levers and clevises that brings the brake shoes up against the wheel. And then when it's time to release those brakes, he moves that lever to another position, which allows the valve underneath each car to move to another position, which allows the air to exhaust out of the brake cylinder, closes the air off to the brake cylinder, and allows the individual reservoir underneath each car and the brake pipe to charge back up again. That's how it works. So if the train breaks in two, comes uncoupled for some reason, what's going to happen? There's going to be a massive reduction in air, right? And when that happens, each one of those valves underneath one of those cars, they're going to go, oh, massive reduction in air. They're going to completely let all the air come out of that main reservoir, go into that brake cylinder, and the whole train's going to come to a stop. That's why they call it automatic air. That's a very basic explanation. Just a quick historical overview. Straight air brake, that came into use in 1868. The automatic air brake with a plain triple valve, or that valve underneath the car, came into use in 1872. They came up with a more improved valve, that same type, in 87. The Type K triple valve, which the majority of our equipment Durango still has, believe it or not, in 1899. And then the more modern valve, the AB, the ABD, the ABDW, those are all the valves, or a version of the valve that came out in 1933 all the way up into current. So the AB valves, if you hear somebody say, well, that's an AB valve underneath this car, that's a more modern valve. There's various versions of it. If you hear somebody like me say K valve or a K triple valve, that's old school stuff. That's really old school stuff. And we still use those in Durango on the majority of our equipment. They work, they're just harder to get parts for anymore. But it doesn't make any difference. You just need to know basically how the brake system works. So the definitions, we talked about the main reservoir. That's on the locomotive, right? That's where all the air is stored in that main reservoir on the locomotive. And that's where the compressor is that makes that air. The brake pipe, a continuous pipe through the train with connections between the locomotive and each car. The auxiliary reservoir, that's that reservoir that's underneath each car. Some cars have an emergency reservoir in addition to the auxiliary reservoir, or their big combined deal. That provides more air reserved for emergency brake application, but they still work the same way. The control valve, that's that valve that's underneath each car. Whether it's a triple valve or an AB valve or whatever, it's the valve that manipulates the brake system underneath the brake system on each car. A service application, that's a normal application of brakes initiated by a slow, controlled reduction of brake pipe pressure. Emergency application, that's when you reduce all of that brake pipe pressure to zero and everything comes to a halt in a hurry. The retainer valve. Remember when I told you that when the engineer, he makes that reduction and the brake's set up because that valve's allowed the air to go in the brake cylinder, then it's time to release and he puts it back and that valve senses that and it releases all the air out of the brake cylinder. Well, where that air comes out of the brake cylinder, whether it's a freight car or a passenger car, it just usually goes down a line and vents to the atmosphere. Most cars have this thing on the end of that line that's called a retainer. You guys will never, ever, I can't imagine, ever want to use these here. We use them in Durango all the time. Basically, what that is, if you're going down a grade and you're the engineer, you make an air reduction and it sets those brakes and you're slowing way down and then you release the brakes again and then all of a sudden it's off to the races. And you're going, wow, I just released them. Now I need to do it again. So you make another set and you slow down and then you're almost going to get too slow. You release them and you're off again. After a while, the air compressor can't keep up making enough air to keep charging the brake pipe between all those continuous applications. So what they did in the old days was that they put a retainer on there and you could set that retainer, the brakeman would do it, and it would slow that release down. So when the engineer released the brakes, it would allow the air to vent to the atmosphere out of the brake cylinder, but it would do it very, very, very slowly. And those brakes would hang on just a little bit longer, releasing gradually. And that gave the engineer a little bit more time to let the air compressor get everything charged back up again before he had to make another set. Again, useless information other than background. I believe most of those cars have retainers on them, So if you see those, when you do an air brake test, the thing you need to know about them is you need to make sure they're all the way down in the open position. If you are out there and the engineer calls you on the train and says, we got something dragging back there. I can't pull this train. Something is dragging back there. That's the first place I go is look at that retainer and make sure that some kid didn't put it up because that'll cause that car to drag. So that's a very basic, simple explanation of that. If you understand that it's all based on an air reduction system and how the basic components work, that's all you need to do. You don't need to know all the different brake valves and where every little port goes. I don't understand any of that. That's people much smarter than me. I barely know enough to manipulate the brakes properly. So this is what a brake cylinder looks like underneath the car for you new guys. This is kind of an older version. That's the brake cylinder. It's kind of hard to see. And then the piston pushes out. And then there's levers and clevises in there that push the shoes up against the wheel. Just for visual, again, here's a brake cylinder and how the mechanical part, when the pressure goes in, pushes it up. This is roughly what it looks like underneath a freight car. There's your handbrake, your mechanical handbrake. Again, these are just for illustration. When you're charging up that brake pipe, here's the brake pipe. Here's the auxiliary reservoir underneath the car. Here's the brake cylinder. And then this is the operating valve. So the red represents that the brake pipe is charged and this auxiliary reservoir is charged. The blue represents that there's no air in the brake cylinder. Then you go on and now you've made a brake pipe reduction. That valve opens up, allows air to come from that auxiliary reservoir into the brake cylinder. And then you can hold that in there until you're ready to release it. And then when you're ready to release it, oh, that's an emergency. That means it took all the air. Took all of the air out of here and shoved it right into there right now. And then you're back to release and charging again. If you put it in emergency because you have to, that's usually not what I would call a very pleasant stop. And when you've got multiple cars and you've got slack action between them, it may not be pleasant back there. And you don't want to knock anybody down and hurt anybody. So an emergency is just that, an emergency. Now in certain situations, it'll go into emergency for reasons unknown. And that's usually a mechanical issue, and they figure that out. 100.0 in the air brake rules, trade air brakes tests and inspections. 100.2 has to do with the general safety inspection of freight and passenger cars. Remember way back this morning we talked about in rule 1.0. I can't remember what it is, but to do an inspection to make sure the cars are safe and suitable. That all the brakes are operative, what the standard brake pipe pressures are. Brake pipe leakage test. A brake pipe leakage test, the idea is we talked about that we charge up that brake pipe, right? We make an application of the air brakes by reducing that brake pipe pressure, which therefore tells the valve to let air go from the individual car reservoir into the brake cylinder. The thing is that if you've got a lot of leakage, like between the connections or anything like that, that air pump's going to be constantly trying to maintain all this, and eventually that brake's going to just leak off. So you need to make sure that that brake pipe and all those connections and everything are relatively tight. And when you do an initial terminal air brake test, when we talk about that in a minute, it talks about how to verify that you don't have too much leakage and that your system is still safe to use. Initial air brake test, that's the specific process for testing your brakes at the beginning of the day. And the piston travel limits. We talked about how the pistons come out and they mechanically push the shoes up against the wheel. Well, after a while, those shoes wear. Just like on an old car with shoe brakes. After a while, they wear and they wear and they wear and they wear. And you'll see that piston travel on that brake cylinder comes farther out and farther out and farther out and farther out and farther out. Somewhere along the line, you got to get underneath that car and change out those brake shoes or adjust the linkage to make sure that brake works. If you've got a car and you're doing a brake test, you go down, yep, piston's out on that one. Yep, piston's out on that one. If they're all out this far, you can pretty much bet those brakes aren't worth a dang. They're not working at all. That is not an operative brake. So it's the whole system works together. It's not just bits and pieces of it. They all have to work together to make this thing work. Along with your air brake tests at the beginning of the day, you're also going to take a look at your locomotive because that's part of the air brake system and do basic inspections. In 101.1, there's general requirements for locomotive daily inspections for both a diesel and a steam locomotive. I won't go into the specifics on that, but I will remind you guys that are going to be working the steam, those pre-departure and daily inspections are an FRA requirement. Those are one of the things that, because we have that steam locomotive and the regulations we operate under, that is a requirement. Here's an example. We talked about piston travel. I don't know if on your timetable, do you have a ruler on that? No. But you can make a mark on there and you're measuring, on most cylinders, you're measuring from the end to where this grease mark is. Some timetables, they put a scale on there just for this reason. And in the rule book, again, I didn't go into it in this presentation, but you can see on the different types of brakes, like a locomotive brake versus a car brake, what the distances are before this is too long where it's no longer a working brake. It should be between 2 points to make it an operative brake. If it gets longer than that, that's when you need to tell somebody If you guys are doing a brake test, it's not working right, so that could be repaired. Securement against movement, I think we talked a lot about that earlier. There's general requirements for that in 102.0. Unattended locomotives, releasing handbrakes, brakes not operating properly, cutting out air brake equipment. Helper engines, I don't think you'll ever have helper engines here, but there might be a occasion where the diesel has to come rescue the steam engine, and then this would come into play, how you would set this up. I'm not going to get into the details on this, but the information is there. The information is there. Securement, again, if you get off a locomotive by itself and walk away from it, you better make sure that you've tied that handbrake and it isn't going to go anywhere. It's unattended. It can't go anywhere. If you're going in to, get a cup of coffee in the depot or something and it's running down there, you need to make sure that it's secured, that you have set that handbrake, released the air brake on it to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. It's amazing how well these brakes work. When I worked for the Grand Canyon Railway, our very first week, and we had these old Southern Pacific commuter cars that were 65 tons and had these big old school UC brakes on them with brake cylinders that looked like 55-gallon drums underneath each car. They were just amazing to me from what I was used to. And we were wondering how long it would take this train to stop going 40 miles an hour out there in the desert with a steam locomotive on the front. We didn't know. We were all just trying to figure out how to run the railroad. Well, sure enough, we had a tail hose at the end of the train, at the end of the brake pipe, that had a emergency brake valve on it to dump all the air out. And it had some hose clamps on it, and the hose clamps came loose, and that hose broke away from the end of the valve and put that train in emergency at 40 miles an hour. Man, we stopped in a hurry. I mean, we were surprised. We probably went, 60, maybe 120 feet, and we were stopped. And it wasn't a real rough stop because of the way those cars were designed, but I was surprised we stopped that quickly. The interesting thing was the steam locomotive, we just put it in service, and we didn't have any fuel oil, so we were at that time burning diesel oil in it, just diesel fuel, and we just filled it up, and there wasn't a gasket on the hatch going down into the fuel tank, and we had no baffles in there. And when it stopped, that fuel went and then just gushed out of the top of the tender down into the cab. So everybody smelled like diesel fuel, after that. But that's a good question. I mean, this railroad, it won't take long to stop, but it'll be a little bit of a rough one just because of the slower speed. Oh yes, there's nothing more labor intensive and unreliable and not cost effective as a steam locomotive. There's a reason that railroads don't use them anymore, but they sure are a lot of fun. But until you've worked on them, I remember years ago in Durango when the Rio Grande first sold it, and they were going to run in the winter for the first time in 50 years. And the rail fan in me thought, oh boy, this is going to be great. This is going to be so much fun, narrow gauge steam and the snow and man against the mountain and all that kind of stuff. After the first week of shoveling out turntable pits and getting underneath trying to bang open the ash pan that froze up and getting the sanders to work, and it was just an absolute nightmare. And that's just to get the engine on the train before we went anywhere. All the nostalgia went out of that after the first month. So yeah, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.